Hello, Narkis. It's good to be with you again, even if it's only virtually. Today, I'd like to explore with you the following question. How should we read the book of Ecclesiastes? Ecclesiastes, or Kohelet to use the Hebrew name, is notorious for its seemingly pessimistic outlook on life, and many theologians and commentators have struggled to square its teachings with those found elsewhere in the Bible. The book's refrain, according to the NIV translation, is this: "Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless." How is this supposed to be understood in the light of the life-affirming gospel of Jesus? One common but misguided approach is to view Kohelet as an outdated commentary on what life was like before Jesus. In other words, the solution is simple. The book's pessimistic message can now just be disregarded, read only, if at all, as an antiquated curiosity that no longer holds any relevant wisdom for the believing community. While it is true that we read the Hebrew Scriptures differently once we hear Jesus declare himself to be their fulfillment, essentially removing Ecclesiastes from the canon sounds to me like willful ignorance, not to mention the false caricature of Old Testament faith that this step involves. I think there is a better way to square Ecclesiastes with the rest of the canon, one that involves rereading the book rather than ignoring the book. Now, Kohelet is a long, winding book, and I don't pretend to be able to unlock all of its enigmas in one short message. But hopefully in the next few minutes, I can give you a new perspective and a few keys to start unlocking the rest of the book in your own time, along with a new motivation to read it afresh. So one of the most important keys to understanding the book is the refrain that I mentioned just a moment ago. So in Hebrew, it sounds like this: Havel Havelim Amar Kohelet, Havel Havelim Hakol Havel. These words appear in chapter 1, verse 2, and are repeated almost verbatim in chapter 12, verse 8, marking both the beginning and the end of Kohelet's words. They are the introduction and conclusion to everything he says, so they're clearly important. Furthermore, the word Hevel by itself also features prominently throughout the book, appearing 38 times in total, which is about half of the total occurrences in the Hebrew Scriptures. So if we're to understand what Kohelet is teaching us, we need to get our heads around this term, Hevel. This is the term that the NIV translates as meaningless, and which gives the book its apparently consistent pessimistic tone. However, I think this translation of Hevel is misleading. Firstly, it suggests that Kohelet is on a quest to find meaning in life, which, as we shall see, I think is incorrect. And secondly, it gives Hevel an inherently negative definition, which I do not think is justified. Etymologically speaking, the term Hevel means breath. It is most likely onomatopoeic, that is, the word is intended to sound like the thing it represents. Well, it sounds like breathing, you see. However, usage is more important than etymology in determining a word's meaning. Do the uses of Hevel in the Hebrew Bible support the etymological definition of breath, or do they demonstrate an evolution in meaning? Well, the word first appears in the Bible as a name. In Genesis chapter 4, we read, "Adam lay with his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, 'With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man.' Later, she gave birth to his brother, Abel." The name given here as Abel is the Hebrew word Hevel. And you know how the story unfolds. Cain, jealous of his brother, commits the first murder. However, as tragic as the story of Cain and Abel is, it does not support an inherently negative definition of Hevel. For starters, it is unlikely that Eve or any mother would name her son meaningless. The basic meaning, breath, makes much better sense in the context of this story and actually carries with it far more irony. At first glance, this name is a life-affirming reminder of the breath of life given to humanity back in chapter 2. But Abel's life is the first life that comes to an end. And so his name gets transformed from being a symbol of life into a symbol of mortal life. Abel's days are cut short. His span is only brief, a mere fleeting breath. You see, the negative side of Hevel is not to do with meaninglessness, but rather with transience. Indeed, to call Abel's life misleading would be out of step with what Genesis 4 is saying. For although Abel is murdered, this mortal also found favor with God. We read that in verse 4. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering. And it is perhaps with one eye to this story that Psalm 144 writes, O Lord, what is man that you care for him, the son of man that you think of him? Man is like a breath, Hevel. His days are like a fleeting shadow. In some contexts, the word Hevel gains a negative connotation in association with idolatry. Take Jeremiah chapter 10, for example, which compares the idols to the one true God. Jeremiah says in verse 14, everyone is senseless and without knowledge. Every goldsmith is shamed by his idols. Now, why is that? Well, he gives 3 reasons. 1, his images are a fraud. 2, they have no breath in them. And 3, moving to verse 15, they are Hevel. Now, the word breath in verse 14 is actually not the word Hevel. It is the synonym ruach, breath, spirit, wind. The word Hevel, as I just mentioned, appears in verse 15. And the NIV has translated it here with another inherently negative term, worthless. But doing this erases the wordplay. You see, the idols are without breath, without ruach, because they are not truly alive. Yet paradoxically, they are also merely Hevel. They are merely breath. They have no ruach, but they are merely breath in the sense that they are going to perish, as the second half of verse 15 goes on to say. You see, Hevel is only negative in this context because Jeremiah is speaking about gods who are non-existent on the one hand, and yet paradoxically mortal on the other. Jeremiah would agree that the idols are worthless, but the word he uses to poetically describe them is Hevel, breath. And these 3 shortcomings of the idols are directly contrasted with the way Jeremiah describes the Lord in verse 10, who is, quote, the true God. He is the living God, the eternal King. So you see, God is true, but the idols are called frauds. God is living. The idols are said to have no breath, no ruach, no spirit in them. God is eternal, and the idols are Hevel. Now, the opposite of eternal is not meaninglessness or worthlessness, but being temporary, transient, and fleeting. So when Kohelet introduces the term Hevel, there is no justification from the rest of the Bible for an inherently negative translation like meaningless. Let the word sit as breath and watch how the author plays with it. I'm not saying that doing this will suddenly remove all the pessimism from Ecclesiastes. It will, however, allow the book to develop in a more 3-dimensional way. If Hevel is meaninglessness, then the refrain of the book from start to finish is unflinchingly pessimistic. Meaningless, meaningless at the start, meaningless, meaningless at the end. However, if Hevel simply means breath, then the book is allowed room to explore different aspects of mortality. A fleeting breath, says Kohelet. A fleeting breath. Everything is but a breath. Kohelet's attitude towards the breathiness of life changes over the course of the book. I've already implied in my translation just a moment ago that one of Kohelet's main concerns will be the fleeting nature of life. But there is another dimension to life's breathiness, which we haven't yet touched on. You see, a breath is not just a fleeting thing, a momentary thing. It is also a repeating thing. And this is actually the first aspect of Hevel that Kohelet focuses on in chapter 1. If you have a Bible in front of you, you can look at chapter 1, verse 4. Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun sets and hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows to the south and turns to the north. Round and round it goes, ever returning on its course, and so on and so on. You see, it's like breathing in and out, a series of fleeting breaths. The famous poem about time in chapter 3 offers a similarly cyclical description of life's experiences. There's a time for this and a time for that, breathing in, breathing out. Chapter 1 primarily flows as an answer to the question in verse 3. What does man gain from all his labor at which he toils under the sun? And Kohelet's initial answer is indeed very gloomy. Chapter 2, verse 17 is his initial conclusion, and it is the lowest point in Ecclesiastes. He writes, "So I hated life, because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is hevel, cyclical, fleeting," or in his words, a chasing after the wind. Now, for most readers and scholars, Kohelet's early despair steamrolls the intricate maturation of thought that occurs in the rest of the book. But the book actually goes through 3 rough phases. The first movement of the book reveals Kohelet's initial frustration with the transience and cyclicity of life. Here you will find Hevel in contexts to do with chasing after the wind, as we just saw a moment ago, or in descriptions of life as a great wrong, chapter 2, verse 21, or a miserable task, chapter 4, verse 8. Around the book's middle, however, these negative associations with Hevel completely disappear, and the breathiness of life is considered more objectively or philosophically. Towards the end of the book, you will start to see Hevel discussed more and more in reference to joy and contentment, something which presents itself as quite an enigma to the typical static reading of the book. Now, it is true that passages advocating contentment and joy are littered throughout Ecclesiastes, but they come increasingly uncontested and emphatic as the book progresses. Just listen to the progression shown in these verses. So, chapter 2, verse 24, "There is no better thing for man to do than to eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil." Nothing better. Chapter 5, verse 17, "Take note of what I have discovered. It is good and right to eat and drink and find enjoyment in one's toil." Chapter 8, verse 15, "So I praise joy, for there is no better thing for man to do under the sun than to eat and drink." Chapter 9, "Go, eat your bread with joy, drink your wine with a cheerful heart, always be dressed in white, do not fail to anoint your head with oil, enjoy life with the woman you love." You see, not only does Kohelet move from despair to joy, he also moves from having thoughts to giving instructions. Did you notice that? In fact, if you look at a graph of when Kohelet gives imperative commands in the book, you will notice that they are weighted towards the end of the book, as Kohelet's thought journey comes to a more settled conclusion. And these commands are essentially of 2 types. Let me show you another graph. In this graph, you'll see 4 different colors representing the different types of imperatives, different types of commands that you'll find in the book of Ecclesiastes. Chapter numbers at the bottom. The frequency is the height axis. We can essentially rule out the gray ones. They're just rhetorical imperatives. They're not anything to do with him coming to conclusions. They're just him saying things like, listen to this, take note of this, that sort of thing. So we can get rid of the gray. And what we're left with is essentially 2 categories. You've got the 2 shades of green and the 1 shade of purple. The 2 shades of green are carpe diem imperatives, seize the day. The light green imperatives are things like, whatever your hands find to do it with all your might, or cast your bread upon the waters. These kinds of instructions to take every opportunity. And the darker green ones are those which we saw from a moment ago in chapter 9, which is telling you to enjoy life. But what stops these imperatives from becoming a simple eat and drink for tomorrow we die mantra is the second kind of instructions, the ones in purple. These instruct us to fear God, culminating with the poem of chapter 12, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. Now, if Ecclesiastes is all about the meaninglessness of life, then instructions to seize the day and to fear God seem like non sequiturs. But if Ecclesiastes is actually a meditation on human creatureliness and limitation, on our finitude, then they make much more sense. Enjoy life, for it is brief and precious, and fear the Creator, for your life is in his hands. Life remains hevel, unpredictably cyclic and transient, but Kohelet's relationship to this limitation has changed over the course of his meditations, particularly as he becomes more cognizant of his Creator. Like Abel, the dust returns to the earth as it once was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it, Kohelet's words in chapter 12, verse 7. But he also says, in chapter 5, verse 20, that the righteous person does not often consider the days of his life, because God keeps him occupied with the joy of his heart. Once God is seen as the giver of our time, the breathiness of life can be viewed as the very gift of life, rather than a threat to our lives. Time is the medium by which we experience creaturely existence. The transient and unpredictable cycles of time are experiences that lead Kohelet to fear the God who controls his fate. This explains the narrator's comment in chapter 12, verse 13, that the conclusion of the matter is, fear God and keep his commandments. Throughout the course of Ecclesiastes, this fear moves from hopeless despair into a wise foundation for contented joy, because God blesses those who fear him with the enjoyment of life. Viewed in this way, Kohelet's conclusion erases his earlier pessimism and places Ecclesiastes squarely within the Jewish wisdom tradition. In this case, however, the fear of God is not expounded to be the beginning of wisdom or of knowledge, like in Proverbs, but rather the beginning of contentment and joy as a creature under the Creator. And this is still a very relevant lesson for people today. I encourage you to reread the book of Ecclesiastes, replacing the word hevel or breath for each mention of meaninglessness you might come across, or whatever it is your translation puts there, maybe vanity or whatever. And with this broader framework in mind, maybe you will see something new. But before we close, I want to say one more thing about our temporal, breathy existence in relation to Jesus. Far from giving us a license to dismiss Ecclesiastes, once understood correctly, Jesus actually confirms its message, the finding of joy in time under God. For in Jesus, God took on our breathy existence. Even more importantly, in Jesus' resurrection, he affirmed the enduring goodness of our temporal limitations. For Jesus did not come back to life as anything other than a breathy human being. Yes, death was defeated. Yes, he ascended into heaven. But he did all of these things as a man of flesh, blood, and time. The book of Hebrews sees this as being very important for our salvation. In chapter 1 we read, "For surely it is not angels he helps, but Abraham's descendants. For this reason, he, Jesus, had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people." Or in chapter 7 of Hebrews, we read, "Because Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. Therefore, he is able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. Jesus is God embodied in time. He was resurrected to be the everlasting center of divine fellowship with human beings. Although finite creatures cannot know God the Creator as well as the eternal God knows himself, Jesus' enduring humanity invites people to know God as completely as they can relate to any other person. In Jesus, God perpetually humbles himself, taking the form of an embodied person forever in time, not only mediating on behalf of man to God, but also mediating God's presence to man. God's end goal for the universe is not a disembodied, atemporal, heavenly existence. Jesus' resurrection promises a new creation, without sin or death or crying or pain, yes, but we cannot escape our creatureliness, nor should we want to. That was arguably what led to humanity's fall in Genesis 3. We will always be dependent on the Creator for the gift of our time. But in Jesus, God is shown to be forever for us. And so, like Kohelet, even more so than Kohelet, we can find joy in our time, both now and forever, as we receive it as loved creatures under God. Time only becomes an existential threat or a threat of meaninglessness when we try to live life as if it were not God's gift. Time is a limitation that we experience because we are creatures dependent upon God for our moment-by-moment existence. And we will always be creatures dependent on God for our existence. The good news that Jesus reveals is that God has committed himself to bless us forever within our time, even partaking of this creaturely limitation of time in order that we might come to know him more and more deeply as time goes on into eternity. So embrace each moment. It is the gift of a God who is determined to bless you. Let me finish with a prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for the gift of our time, and we pray that along with Kohelet, you would give us a clear perspective on our creaturely limitations in relation to your divine goodness, and especially also of your great divine love shown to us in the promises that you made through Jesus' resurrection. Father, thank you that you are determined to bless us in our time, and we ask, Lord, that we would find contentment and joy as creatures under your hand. Amen.